When Armand first stepped off the bus into this country, the air had felt different, sharper somehow, scented faintly with wet asphalt and roasted coffee drifting from some unseen café. It was winter, or close to it. He remembered his breath, fogging out in pale clouds as he shouldered the single duffel bag that carried everything he owned. Back then, he had been 23, restless, and absolutely certain that if he worked hard enough, the world would eventually open its doors. To him, in those early months, the country had felt like a giant puzzle. The streets were wide, almost unnaturally straight, flanked by buildings that seemed to rise without end. Traffic lights blinked with mechanical indifference. People hurried past without glancing up from their phones, and the language, though he had studied it for years, felt heavier here, as though every word carried a weight he had never practiced lifting. But Armand adapted quickly. He took the jobs no one else wanted, cleaning in the early hours, carrying crates in the back rooms of grocery stores, fixing leaky pipes for cash under the table. He rented a narrow room above a laundromat, where the walls rattled each time the dryers spun, and the smell of detergent clung stubbornly to his clothes. Years passed in a rhythm of labor and quiet ambition. He made friends, not many, but enough to gather for tea on Sundays, enough to share news from home, and to laugh about the absurdities of this new world. He saved what little he could, sending part of it back to his mother, who would reply with handwritten letters covered in looping scripts and pressed flower petals that still smelled faintly of the countryside, where he had grown up. He never thought much about immigration paperwork. It was something distant and invisible, like the bones beneath the skin, important, but not something you considered until something broke. Then one ordinary morning, it broke. The letter came in a plain white envelope, thin and no official seal, no heavy paper, nothing to warn him that his life was about to tilt sideways. He found it wedged under his apartment door, the postman too impatient to climb to the third floor. He opened it while leaning against the kitchen counter, expecting perhaps a bill or some notice from the building manager. Instead, his eyes landed on the words "Final Notice" in block letters at the top, and the world seemed to constrict around him. They claimed there had been a problem with his visa renewal, an administrative error. They called it, though it felt more like a trap. He had 30 days to leave the country voluntarily. 30 days to dismantle the life he had built, to say goodbye to friends, to abandon the savings plan he had guarded so carefully. The letter's tone was flat, almost polite, but beneath it was a blade. For a while, he just stood there, holding the paper, staring at the thin black ink, as if reading it over and over might force the words to change. Then came the rush of thoughts, the what-ifs, the how-could-theys. He tried calling the immigration office, but the lines were clogged with other desperate voices. And the one time he got through, the woman on the phone repeated the same phrases as if she were reading from a script. The next days blurred together in a haze of dread. He barely slept, and when he did, his dreams were sharp-edged and feverish. Trains leaving without him, the sound of locks clicking, his childhood home fading into dust. He still went to work, because what else could he do? But every hour felt stolen, every task meaningless. He began avoiding friends, not wanting to explain the situation, not wanting to hear the pity in their voices. It was during this stretch of sleepless, panic-soaked days that she appeared. It happened in the most unremarkable of places, the back corner of a dim café, where he sometimes went to nurse a cheap cup of tea and watch the rain beat against the window. He had been staring blankly at the street outside when he heard the scrape of a chair opposite him. He looked up, and there she was. At first, he thought she must have mistaken him for someone else. She didn't ask if the seat was taken. She simply sat, her coat draped elegantly around her shoulders, her gloves resting lightly on the table. She was not beautiful in a loud, obvious way, but in the way that draws the eye without explanation. Her hair was dark and perfectly still despite the wind outside. Her eyes a shade he couldn't name, not brown, not green, but something that shifted with the light. "You look like a man who's run out of time," she said softly. It startled him more than it should have. People didn't speak like that here. He opened his mouth to reply, but she continued, her voice carrying an accent he couldn't place. "I can help you." He almost laughed, but there was something in her expression, something calm and assured, that made him pause. She didn't look like a scammer, and yet her timing was too precise to be coincidence. "You don't even know me," he said. Her lips curved slightly. "I know enough." He never knew how much she truly understood about his situation in that moment. Later, when he thought back on it, he would wonder if someone had told her, or if she had simply guessed, reading the tension in his posture, the shadows under his eyes. All he knew was that the conversation that followed would set in motion the strangest and most dangerous chapter of his life. That was the day he learned that salvation could walk in unannounced, wearing a tailored coat and speaking in riddles. And though he didn't know it yet, that salvation came with secrets far heavier than his own. When she first spoke to him, it wasn't only the words that caught his attention, it was the way she spoke them. Every syllable seemed deliberate, balanced on the edge of softness and precision, as though she were weighing the sound before letting it escape. Her voice didn't rush. It lingered, patient, like someone used to being listened to. She sat across from him in that dim café, folding her gloves neatly on the table as though it were a ritual. Even the way she placed her hands, fingers relaxed but aligned, carried a kind of discipline he couldn't quite name. She wasn't restless. She didn't fidget, didn't scan the room the way most people in public spaces did. She was fully present, her gaze fixed on him in a way that made him feel seen, not just looked at, but measured, assessed. Her clothes were understated but unmistakably expensive. The coat was a deep charcoal wool, cut in a style that might have been Parisian, though he wasn't sure. It draped over her frame like water over stone, perfectly tailored but without us. Around her neck, a silk scarf in muted colors, cream, copper, and a hint of teal, was knotted in a way that suggested both elegance and practicality. The scent that reached him was faint and layered. Something floral, yes, but beneath it, a darker note, like sandalwood or aged leather. It was her eyes, though, that unsettled him most. Not because they were cold, they weren't, but because they seemed to shift depending on the light, as if they couldn't decide what color they wanted to be. When the café-esque yellow pendant lamp caught them, they glinted warm and amber. When a shadow passed, they cooled into something closer to moss green. He wondered if she knew that about herself, if she used it to her advantage. The first few minutes of their conversation were strange, almost unreal. She didn't introduce herself right away. Instead, she began asking him questions, not the polite, surface-level ones people ask out of habit, but direct ones that cut past pretense. Where was he from? How long had he been here? Did he have family in the country? The rhythm of her speech was smooth, but there was no mistaking that she was steering the exchange. At some point, the conversation slipped almost seamlessly into another language. It was one he hadn't heard in years, the language of his childhood, and she spoke it fluently, her accent so precise that it startled him. He answered her without thinking, and for a few minutes it felt like home had stepped into the café and sat down beside him. Then, just as easily, she shifted to a third language, one he recognized from music and movies, though he couldn't speak it. Her pronunciation was effortless, her tone melodic. "You speak a lot of languages," he said, trying to mask his astonishment. "6," she replied, not as a boast but as a fact. "Fluently at least, a few more passably." It was the "at least" that made him wonder. People who truly command such skills often downplay them. But there was a confidence in her admission, not arrogance, but the certainty of someone who had spent years perfecting a craft. He began to imagine what it must be like to walk through the world, able to slip between tongues, to step into any conversation, any culture, as though you belonged there. She didn't explain how she had learned them all, and he didn't ask. Not yet, but there were hints in the way she carried herself, a certain adaptability, a way of reading the room without obviously scanning it, that made him think she had lived many lives before this one. What struck him most was that nothing about her seemed accidental. The tilt of her head when she listened, the pause before answering, even the way she sipped her coffee, everything felt deliberate, as though she were always aware of the image she presented. And yet, despite that control, there was something else flickering beneath the surface, a quickness in her gaze, a slight tightening at the corners of her mouth when she thought he wasn't looking. It was as if she were keeping a door firmly shut, and behind it lay the truth of who she really was. The offer came so quietly that, for a moment, he thought he'd misheard her. They were still sitting in that corner booth of the café, the rain threading down the glass behind her, when she leaned forward and said, almost conversationally, "We could get married." He blinked at her. "I'm sorry." "What?" Her gaze didn't waver. "Married to me. It would solve your problem." He laughed, a short, uncertain sound, but it died almost instantly when he saw she wasn't joking. There was no trace of amusement in her eyes. Instead, there was a stillness, like water holding its breath. "I don't even know you," he said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "You don't need to," she replied. "You just need to know that I can help you stay here, and you can help me in ways you don't yet understand." It was the way she said, yet that unnerved him. He sat back, gripping the edge of his mug as if it were an anchor. The thought of marrying a stranger, even for survival, was absurd, dangerous. But the image of the final notice letter hovered in his mind. Its block letters like iron bars. He had 24 days left before the government expected him to leave. 24 days to pack up a life that had taken nearly a decade to build. "What would you get out of it?" he asked, narrowing his eyes. Her answer came after a pause, as if she were weighing how much to reveal. "Security, stability, a layer of protection I find useful." She didn't elaborate, and he sensed she wouldn't, even if pressed. The silence that followed was thick, interrupted only by the low hum of the espresso machine and the occasional hiss of steam. Outside, a bus roared past, splashing water onto the curb. Inside, it felt like the world had narrowed to the space between them. He thought about the consequences. This wasn't just a piece of paper. It was entanglement, legal, personal, maybe even moral. If anyone found out the marriage wasn't real, there would be questions, investigations, maybe even prison. And yet, wasn't deportation its own kind of prison? one without bars, but with borders that would keep him away from everything he had worked for. She seemed to sense his hesitation. "I'm not asking for romance," she said. "No strings, no expectations. We sign the documents, we live, convincingly, and in a few years, we go our separate ways." It was almost clinical, the way she put it, as though they were discussing a business contract rather than a shared life. "And what if I say no?" he asked. Her eyes didn't change, but her tone cooled by a fraction. "Then you'll be on a plane before the month is over, and we'll never see each other again." From the outside, her apartment looked like any other in the aging brick building on 17th Street, narrow windows, rusted balcony rails, the faint smell of fried onions from a neighbor's kitchen drifting through the hallways. If anything, it leaned toward the unremarkable, but he quickly learned that the unremarkable could be its own kind of disguise. The first time he stepped inside, he was struck by the quiet, not the kind that comes from a lack of noise, but the kind that feels intentional. The curtains were drawn halfway, letting in a muted light that flattened the colors of the room. The furniture was minimal: a small sofa, a low coffee table, two mismatched chairs. Everything was clean, almost meticulously so, but without warmth. No photographs on the walls, no knickknacks collecting dust on shelves. The only personal touch was a single vase on the table, holding fresh white lilies whose fragrance softened the air. Her kitchen was equally spare: a few neatly stacked plates, a kettle, a French press, and exactly 3 mugs. When he remarked on it, she smiled faintly and said, "I don't keep things I don't use." It was a philosophy she seemed to live by. Her wardrobe, which he caught glimpses of when she left the bedroom door ajar, was small but exact: a row of neatly hung coats, each in a neutral shade, shoes polished to a soft sheen, scarves and silks and cashmeres, folded in perfect rectangles. There was nothing in excess, yet everything she owned was of quietly impeccable quality. And yet, for someone so controlled, she spoke very little about her past. When he asked casual questions, where she'd grown up, what her family was, like, her answers were brief, vague, as if she were flipping through an internal script designed to deflect curiosity. Sometimes she would change the subject entirely, asking him something unexpected in return, redirecting his attention like a skilled magician. But there were moments when the mask slipped on. Once, while helping her carry groceries up the stairs, he noticed her hesitate outside her own door, fishing in her bag for the keys. The pause was so slight he might have missed it, but when she unlocked the door, her hand lingered on the key for a beat too long, as though listening for something. On the other side, another time, he found a scrap of paper on the kitchen counter with a list of numbers scrawled in an unfamiliar handwriting. When he asked about it, she crumpled it without looking and said it was just a delivery note. But the numbers didn't look like prices, they looked like coordinates. There were also the phone calls. He would hear her in the other room, speaking in a language he couldn't place, not one of the 6 she'd mentioned in the café. Her tone was clipped, almost formal, and when she noticed him within earshot, she would end the call abruptly, sliding the phone into her pocket, as if sealing the conversation away. Still, for all the mysteries, her life appeared simple to anyone looking from the outside. She walked to the market on Tuesdays, always buying the same vegetables. She returned library books on time. She kept a small battered notebook in her coat pocket, in which she sometimes wrote while waiting for the kettle to boil. But he began to suspect that these routines were not born of habit, but of careful construction, a stage set designed to look ordinary while hiding something much larger behind it. It was late in the evening, one of those autumn nights when the air outside was brittle enough to carry sound farther than it should. He was sitting at the small kitchen table, sifting through a pile of immigration forms he didn't fully understand, the kind that turned his pulse uneven just by being in front of him. The apartment was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Then, her phone rang. It wasn't the usual soft chime he'd heard before. This was sharper, almost mechanical, like an old landline buried inside a digital device. The sound came from the other room, and she moved to answer it with an urgency that made him pause mid-scribble. He didn't mean to listen, but the tone of her voice drew his ear. The language she spoke wasn't one he recognized. It wasn't one of the 6 she had admitted to in the café, and it didn't have the melodic lilt of the other tongues he'd overheard her use in the street. This was clipped, percussive, short bursts of syllables, sometimes punctuated with a sharper, almost hissing sound. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but even without understanding the words, he could feel the weight of them. It wasn't casual conversation. A pause. Then the sound of her pacing, her footsteps slow and deliberate. She said something in that same language, the syllables pressed together like stones in a wall. The call ended abruptly, and without a word, she walked into the bedroom, pulled on her coat, and slipped her gloves over her hands. "Where are you going?" he asked. She glanced over her shoulder, her expression unreadable. "Out, that's all you're giving me." Her mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "That's all you need." The door closed behind her, and the faint scent of her perfume, that layered blend of something floral and something older, deeper, lingered. In the air he sat there for a while, telling himself it wasn't his business. They weren't a real couple. This wasn't the kind of relationship where you asked questions about where the other person went at night, but the thought itched at him. He imagined her walking down the street under the orange street lamps, slipping into the back seat of a black car, vanishing into the city's veins. Hours passed. He made tea. He tried reading. At some point, he dozed off at the table, his head resting on his folded arms. The sound of the door unlocking woke him. It was almost 3 in the morning. She stepped inside without switching on the light, closing the door softly behind her. He stayed still, watching her from the shadowed kitchen. Her hands, bare now, were dusted with something pale. In the dim light from the hallway, it looked like flour, but when she brushed it against the hem of her coat, it caught the light in a way flour never would. Marble dust, he thought, though he couldn't have explained why. That was the first thing that came to mind. She shrugged off her coat, and as she did, a faint, woody scent drifted across the room. Cedar, rich and dry, like the inside of an old chest. It was a smell that didn't belong to her apartment. "You're awake," she said, her voice as calm as if she'd just returned from buying milk. "I couldn't sleep." She hung her coat in the closet and didn't elaborate. He thought about asking. The question swelled in his throat, but he swallowed it. He knew instinctively that if he pushed, she would simply give him an answer so clean and well-rehearsed, it would leave him feeling foolish for asking. Instead, they stood in the quiet for a moment longer, then she walked past him toward the bedroom, the cedar scent trailing behind her like a ghost. That night, he lay awake for hours, listening to the faint sound of her moving around in the next room. Every so often, he would hear the soft click of a drawer opening, the muted rustle of fabric, the metallic chime of something small being set down. He imagined her unpacking secrets, artifacts from a life he had no access to, and wondered how much longer he could pretend not to notice. It was the first time, he thought, with real certainty, that whatever she was hiding, it was something far bigger than him, and far more dangerous. It happened on a Sunday, one of those cold, brittle mornings when the city felt like it was holding its breath. She had been restless all morning, moving from room to room without settling, glancing at her phone more often than usual. He noticed it but didn't ask. He had learned by now that her silences were deliberate. They weren't gaps in conversation, they were walls. Just after noon, she slipped on her coat, the charcoal one with the subtle stitching along the lapel, and told him she had an errand. It was a word she used often, one that could mean anything from buying bread to disappearing for 2 days. This time, something in her tone made him curious enough to follow. He waited a few minutes after she left, then stepped out into the street, keeping a cautious distance. She walked with purpose, her stride steady, never once glancing over her shoulder. The city's noise thinned as she moved away from the main roads, down narrower streets where old buildings leaned toward each other like conspirators. Finally, she stopped at a black sedan idling at the curb. The driver, tall, in a dark coat, stepped out to open the rear door for her. She slid inside without hesitation, and the car pulled away. He almost gave up then. But something in him, some stubborn thread of curiosity, refused to loosen. He hailed a taxi and told the driver to follow at a distance. The ride stretched on longer than he expected, the city giving way to quieter neighborhoods. Then 2 stretches of road lined with bare winter trees. Eventually, the sedan turned onto a private drive, flanked by stone pillars. A wrought-iron gate stood ahead, its bars twined with dormant ivy. The taxi driver slowed, glancing at him in the mirror. "Private property," he said. "I know," Armin replied. "Just stop here." From where he sat, he could see the gate swing open as the black car approached. Beyond it, the road curved out of sight, but he caught a glimpse of something, a roofline, slate tiles gleaming dully in the pale light. It wasn't until the sedan disappeared into the trees that he got out and began walking. The path beyond. The gate was quiet, muffled by fallen leaves and the faint crunch of gravel under his shoes. And then, as the trees thinned, he saw it. The mansion rose from the earth as though it had always been there, older than the road that led to it, older than the forest itself. Its walls were pale stone, weathered but unyielding, stretching upward into towers capped with dark, steeply pitched roofs. Dozens of windows, tall, narrow, and framed in carved stone, caught the light in shards. An arched balcony curved out from the second floor, its railings wrought in intricate spirals of iron. It was too much to take in at once. The place was enormous, but it wasn't the size alone that struck him. It was the feeling. Standing there, he had the strange sensation of being watched, as if the building itself were aware of him. She emerged from a side entrance, speaking briefly to the driver before disappearing back inside. From this distance, she looked different. Smaller, yes, but also somehow more at home. Her posture shifted, her steps more certain, her movements free of the quiet restraint she wore in the apartment. He wanted to call out to her, to demand an explanation, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he stood there until the cold began to sting his fingers. The walk back to the road felt longer than the walk in. He didn't take the taxi this time. He needed the space to think. When she returned to the apartment that evening, she didn't mention where she had been. She set her gloves on the table, poured herself a glass of water, and asked him if he had eaten. Her tone was casual, but there was a faint glimmer in her eyes, as if she knew he'd seen something, and was waiting to see if he'd admit it. He didn't. But from that day forward, the image of the mansion stayed with him, haunting the edges of his thoughts. It wasn't just a house. It was a truth she was keeping from him, and he knew, with a certainty that made his chest tighten, that one day, that truth would come for both of them.